The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. Should we mention that thing we were just talking about off air, Pat? Because that could actually be interesting, I think, for the audience.
I'd rather keep my medical history private, just between the two of us, if that's okay with you.
No, we're not going to talk about that rash. What I mean is that Pat and I had been talking about here in Massachusetts, blue state, and it kind of actually relates to the first story on the bonus show. Blue state, history of Republican governors. Mitt Romney, a very famous one. Charlie Baker right now, who is a sort of non-Trump Republican and, quite frankly, a pretty moderate Republican on many issues, although I'd rather have Deval Patrick back, for example. And neither Pat nor I were going to vote for Charlie Baker, but his opponent on the Democratic side, Jay Gonzalez, is not a particularly inspiring Democrat. And so I had told Pat I was thinking of leaving it blank because I'm not voting for Charlie Baker, but there were other things I actually felt strongly about. I didn't feel strongly about Jay Gonzalez. And I filled out my entire ballot this morning and got to the end. And then I said, you know what? I think it's a problem that we have this great blue state and that Democrats have trouble often winning the governor's race. I knew there was no risk that Jay Gonzalez would win. Charlie Baker is going to get reelected easily. So I went back and I said, I'm going to vote for Jay Gonzalez, even though he's not my favorite Democrat. I think he's better than Charlie Baker. And I want to give one more vote to Democrats. So I went back and actually filled it in. And it's like, does it even really matter, Pat? I mean, it's just, he has no chance in any way. It's like, what does this even mean?
Isn't it amazing, though, that both you and I followed politics on a daily basis, and we went into the voting booth unsure how we were going to vote in the Massachusetts governor's race, and I ended up just leaving it blank. I just was completely unimpressed with Jay Gonzalez. I watched all three debates that he had with Charlie Baker, and he just didn't have numbers to support any of his arguments. He wasn't good in that format. He didn't come across as a leader. And I didn't feel comfortable signing my name next to him. And it is unfortunate. If we had a better Democratic candidate, I certainly would have supported him or her. But I couldn't just do it because he had a D next to his name. And I'm probably going to take some heat for this.
That's totally fair.
You know, and the thing is, if it was a Senate race where it was a Republican incumbent going up against some challenger who I didn't agree with on everything and I didn't think they were the best person for the job, I still would have sucked it up and voted for the Democrat, knowing that majorities matter and that if you vote for a Republican in Massachusetts, it's pretty similar to voting for a Republican in Louisiana because that's just the body of the Senate and how that works. So if it was some sort of national race, I wouldn't be as conflicted as I was with this, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't vote for Jay Gonzalez. Charlie Baker's going to win here anyway. It was a tough decision, I have to say.
Yeah, and this relates to the story that we're talking about, which is an NPR article pointing out that Maryland and Massachusetts are some of the places where Donald Trump's approval rating is of the lowest in the country, in the low 30s, and yet the Republican governors in Maryland and Massachusetts have approval ratings around 70%. And this is an interesting thing in Massachusetts, and at the same time, it's not that interesting because what we basically learn from this is that if you're a moderate Republican and you get elected in Massachusetts because there's very often just weak Democratic challengers. We saw this a bunch of different times over the last few years. The Massachusetts blue voters, who are very, very liberal, some of the most liberal in the country, are not going to merely for party identification reasons say, we don't like the governor. And Charlie Baker is only somewhat more conservative than a moderate Democrat. And there are Democrats I talk to who don't really agree with some of the political positions that he espouses. But when it comes to what he's done, limited very much by a liberal state legislature, they say, he's really not that bad. I think he's actually a honest guy, and I'm going to vote for him.
Yeah, there's even an argument to be made that Massachusetts does well under Republican governors because the legislature is so overwhelmingly blue that if you also have a Democratic governor, they just kind of bicker amongst themselves and have a hard time getting things passed. But when there's a Republican governor, they realize they actually have to put together bills that can be passed and go forward. So, yeah, it is unfortunate. I think what it boils down to is the importance of primaries, right, and getting the right candidates for the job. I supported Gonzalez's opponent in the primary, Bob Massey, I think his name is. And, hopefully the next time around we get someone stronger in there. I don't think Charlie Baker will end up running for a third time. But yeah, that's why primaries I think are so important. Got to get the right people for the job.
Before we go to the next story, I do want to just remind you, please take the David Pakman Show audience survey if you haven't. It takes 90 seconds. It's really a huge thing for us that we're doing, and it's going to give us very important information. davidpakman.com/survey. 90 seconds. We've gotten hundreds and hundreds. We were targeting 1,000 responses, and we're not that far from it, actually. And if we just make a little push, we will get there. davidpakman.com/survey. We've talked on the program about the possible medical benefits of psychedelics, and there has been more and more interest in this topic recently. And anxiety and depression are now, they've kind of always been under the umbrella of conditions that could benefit from psychedelics, but now they are much more strongly there because there's research that's actually starting now into the development of new pharmaceutical drugs on the basis of these psychedelics. And this includes mushrooms, this includes ecstasy, sometimes known as MDMA, and also ketamine. And those substances are now the subject of research that could potentially create more controlled pharmaceutical grade treatments based on psychedelics, which I think is super interesting. And for the most part, Pat, we're talking about small doses of this stuff. So there is this idea, these treatments are often caricatured as people, quote, tripping balls, as the memes like to say. But that's not really what we're talking about here, although there is certainly, there are modalities that involve actually experiencing the psychedelic effects more strongly. But that's not really what we're talking about. And this is, once again, just another area where the war on drugs restricts progress that could help a lot of people.
It really is interesting stuff. A lot of studies show that MDMA can help with post-traumatic stress disorder. And then with regards to mushrooms, I guess people like cancer patients, people who are coming to the end of their lives for a sickness or, you know, whatever reason, after microdosing with mushrooms tend to come away with this feeling of understanding about what it means to be alive and getting more comfortable with what death is. And, you know, that's all well and good. I think you have to support stuff like that. I think people on the right will make it seem as though, well, we legalized medical marijuana, and this is just the next step on the slippery slope. We told you that people were going to start advocating for medical MDMA and medical mushrooms, but that's not a good argument on its merits. You have to take a look at what the drug actually does and how it treats people.
Absolutely, and I've not heard anybody talk about medicinal heroin or medicinal cocaine at this point, although I think cocaine can be used as a numbing agent for dental work, can't
Heroin comes from a way to treat some sort of addiction that came out of the Civil War. Was it some sort of methamphetamines people, the soldiers were getting, and they used heroin to get them off of it? That didn't work out so well.
Yes. No, it didn't, and that's why right now no one is saying let's make crack cocaine useful for medical purposes. But the other thing that's important to mention is that you're talking not about someone eating a bunch of mushrooms and then going into a psychedelic daze. You're talking about controlled, supervised doses of MDMA or mushrooms combined with talk therapy, and it's very easy to just write all of this stuff off as people wanting to do drugs and have a good time. But this stuff is being studied in a serious manner. We're talking about controlled environments. It's caricatured very often, and it's totally unfair.
Remember about a year ago, we had Rick Doblin on the program, and I guess he'll supervise you if you want to trip on a certain substance, be it mushrooms or whatever else. Did you end up taking him up on that offer? I think he wanted you as a client.
I didn't. No, I didn't do that, and that was a great interview. And maybe we'll rerun that as a classic interview when when the time is right. Maybe when there are some developments in the legalization of some of these at the next level. Hey, we actually have had conversations over the last week about this issue of convicted felons and voting, and there are millions of people around the U.S. who are ineligible to vote on the basis of their felony records, and this includes the state of Florida. In Florida, if you have a felony record, even after you get out of prison, you can't vote. And there's a ballot measure that is on the ballot today, this year, in Florida, which, depending on the results, could re-enfranchise 1.4 million people in Florida who have these felony records. Iowa and Kentucky as well as Florida, are the 3 states where if you've ever committed a felony, even if you've already served your time or are off parole or whatever the consequences were, you are still not allowed to vote. So I am obviously in favor of this, and I've heard arguments, as I've said before, Pat, that legally seem defensible for why while in prison you shouldn't be allowed to vote, although I personally disagree with them. I've heard no good legal arguments as to why even when you are out of prison and no longer on parole, you shouldn't be allowed to vote. And I hope Florida does the right thing on this.
I suspect they will. I certainly hope they will. I think that's pretty clear cut, right? If you served your time in prison, you should be able to come out and have your rights restored and all of your rights, right? I think that's pretty clear cut. When it comes to people currently in prison, I don't know how I feel about that. Certainly, you can make the argument that when you go to prison, you commit a felony and are convicted, some rights are taken away from you. The government already restricts your freedom, so there is a basis for them to also restrict your right to vote. I think that's sound, but it doesn't really get into the idea of whether it's a good idea, whether it's good policy or not. And I could probably be swayed either way.
Wouldn't there be a case to be made that the restriction of freedom if you commit a crime doesn't seem to be addressed in the same way in our founding documents that the inalienable right to vote is enshrined?
Well, what about like the freedom of, the right to bear arms? Certainly, if you're put in prison, you can't have a gun with you. But then there are other rights, like you're still able to speak your mind openly. You're still able to practice your religion. I think it depends on the right, and they're not applied equally.
Are you not able to have the gun in prison, though, because of... you're not able to have the gun in prison because prisons don't allow guns other than on law enforcement personnel, right? I mean, I guess that's an interesting one, but is it... We have to figure out what the explanation is.
Yeah, I mean, I think there certainly is legal precedent. I think it's just better to attack it on its merits, whether it actually is a good idea or not. I mean, I could come up with some examples, like if someone is put behind bars for the rest of their life because they live in California, let's say, and they have a 3-strike law there, and they got locked up for something simple like marijuana possession, wouldn't it make sense for that felon to at least have some sort of political say over their situation by being able to cast a ballot for someone who's trying to do away with that law? Now, I feel like they should. But if you come up with an example of someone like a convicted murderer also being able to, like, decide who's going to be on the school committee, I'm not going to be in favor of that. So it really depends on the crime, but, I think you have to kind of come up with something that's a little bit more cookie cutter, right? Something that fits everything.
Yeah, I don't think that's a good argument because that's a similar argument to when the homophobes say, listen, we can't have people who are gay deciding as to whether gay people should be allowed to get married because they're biased. And of course, the reaction is, well, people who are heterosexual also bring their personal biases to the issue. So membership or lack of membership in a group that has an interest, I think, is invalid as a way to determine if they should have a say. Because in the same way that people who are in prison might be influenced to vote a certain way on the basis of how a candidate would deal with people in prison, if you aren't in prison, you also bring the bias of the fact that you're a free person to how you would evaluate a plan to do something one way or the other with people that are in prison. So I think it's an interesting idea, but I think that it is actually, I hesitate to go down the slippery slope path, but I think applying that anywhere else we would be pretty concerned about. But I want to hear from the audience on this one. Should those in prison have the right to vote? I believe the answer is yes. If you agree with me, let me know why. If you disagree, let me know why. Vote today. If you haven't voted, vote. And take the survey at davidpakman.com/survey.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.